des invités exceptionnels, tels que le professeur Samuel Furfari, ou ici nous avons le professeur Richard Lindzen, qui est l'un des plus grands physiciens, objectivement, de cette génération. Je cède la parole au professeur Furfari. Bonne soirée.
Merci, merci Drieux. Bonsoir à tout le monde et merci d'avoir répondu à l'invitation du Club de Pan pour cette rencontre exceptionnelle. C'est exceptionnel d'avoir le professeur Lindzen avec nous, qui est né dans le Massachusetts, il a grandi dans le Bronx. À 20 ans, il avait déjà sa licence en physique. C'est quand même exceptionnel, n'est-ce pas? Et donc un brillant scientifique qui a fait toute sa carrière dans l'académie aux États-Unis. Il a terminé sa carrière au MIT avec une carrière où il a été dans d'autres universités également. Il est membre de l'Académie des sciences des États-Unis depuis 1977. Certains d'entre nous n'étaient pas nés à l'époque, mais lui était déjà membre de l'Académie. Et il est membre de l'Académie des sciences de Norvège également. Il a publié plus de 200 articles. Et certainement, si vous êtes là, c'est parce que vous l'avez déjà vu quelque part, vous avez lu son nom. C'est vraiment un privilège d'avoir le professeur Lindzen avec nous. I read recently that you were writing about past example in recent history where things were presented as scientists and then we realized with time that it was a political consensus and not a scientific consensus. And you give me a few examples, and I think that people will be interested to understand that it's not the first time that we are presented with realities that at the end it becomes much more difficult to admit that it was the realities.
No, it's actually not that unusual. It happens frequently, but what I'll stick to are what I would call major cases. And by major cases, I mean cases which were associated with legislation in our country and elsewhere, or otherwise government enforcement. So one of the most famous examples in the US was in 1920s. There was great concern in America about immigration. And there was a feeling that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were stupid. Part of the basis for that was World War I. And when you drafted people in the US, they were given intelligence tests in English. And immigrants did poorly on that. At any rate, it was decided that this was a biological fact, and that in order to preserve America's gene pool, we should restrict immigration to the countries that had already supplied immigrants to the US, namely Great Britain, Ireland, and so on. And it was held that this was demanded by eugenics, that you were obligated to breed your society for the best qualities. There were things that occurred, you know, where you discriminate against people very explicitly. But the thing about it was eugenics was presented as science. And it was again demanded, or at least insisted on, all scientists agreed. There were scientists who did not agree, and some of them left their memoirs. They said that they didn't agree, but it was good to see that science was regarded as important. At any rate, there was the Immigration Restriction Act was passed in 1924. And although eugenics, of course, was discredited by the Nazis, our immigration law continued until the 1960s. That's one of the sad things about using science for politics. Long after the science is discredited, the laws can remain. There is always an insistence that all scientists agree. And there's a reason for that, obviously. A British physicist and novelist, C.P. Snow, I don't know if his name is familiar to anyone at this stage, but he wrote about what he called the two cultures. And Snow had an interesting career. He was an advisor to Churchill on technical matters. He was a novelist. And in seeing the government, I think one thing that strikes anyone who has anything to do with one's government is the realization that most people in politics, at least in the US, and I'm pretty sure elsewhere, really can't do arithmetic. And they really are totally unfamiliar with science.
Microphone, please.
Pardon me? Oh, excuse me. They're unfamiliar with science. You could not ask a politician, what is the second law of thermodynamics? And, you know, and yet, for a scientist, that's very basic. So the question is, how do people feel about that? And I think what you discover is most non-scientists who are innumerate are uneasy about this. They're not comfortable with that. When you speak of something like climate change and you talk about greenhouse effect, they tend to turn off. And they feel insecure. And so you assure such people by telling them all scientists agree. And that, for instance, happened with climate change. As I might get into it later, I mean, the issue began in the 60s, but it was rolled out as global warming in 1988 in the US. And it was done at a US Senate hearing. The issue, in a way, is contrary to science, of course. Science is not a source of authority. It's a mode of asking questions, a mode of inquiry. The trouble is, it's been a successful mode. And as a result, it has acquired authority in the public mind, and politicians who are generally not regarded as authoritative envy this and always wish to exploit it. And to some extent with success. The problem is not a big deal if science is not in the public domain. But if it is a matter of concern to politicians, the fact that the politicians are paying the scientists' salaries is a notable influence factor. Probably longer answer than you wanted.
Professor, to speak like you here in Brussels is a taboo. It's why we are privileged to have you, because it's very rare that we have somebody speaking aloud about science, which is not what all the scientists are saying. And is it the same in USA? What is the difference between USA and Europe? How do you see the difference?
There are some similarities and some differences. The similarities are that all the television networks, the cable TV stations, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, the Washington Post, all of these, not only do not cover any questions about this, but they have openly stated they will not publish anything that questions this. That happened around, didn't happen immediately. Most of these newspapers did cover questions through, I would say, the 90s. And then you began to see the New York Times dismissing also their science reporters. They had excellent ones, and just brought on people who didn't know what they were saying but would say the party line. The Washington Post has done the same. It's the plaything of Bezos, the owner of Amazon, for whatever reason. The worst examples are Science Magazine and Nature. Both of them have now said they will not publish anything that questions this. That's quite astounding. And as I mentioned to you, the former editor of Science who established this policy is now the president of the National Academy, Bolshevik nut. The part that is different is the nature of partisan politics in the US. And this is not totally simple, but as a rule, if one party favors it, the other does not. And so the Democrats, which in America is now a peculiar party, I hesitate to say left and right anymore. And the reason I hesitate is the difference between the parties is not the traditional left-right. The Democrats now are the party of the billionaires, the functionaries serving them, and the welfare clients. And now the Republican Party, which was the party in my childhood of big business, is now the business of the working middle class and the small businessman. And so that colors a lot of American politics. But if you look at the people supporting the Republicans, for instance, they're very dominant in parts of the Midwest, the farming area. And so there it's politically expedient and comfortable for them to object to global climate change as an issue, because the farmers are acutely aware. They hear what happens in Holland and what happens in France and what happens in Ireland, and they realize that for some reason climate change goes after the farmers. So we do have an opposition in the US. There are some newspapers, the New York Post, the Boston Herald, which will take a sympathetic view. So it's not totally gone. But, you know, in France, I don't know of any that would question it. I think the major difference I see here is there's still argument as to whether there's an argument in the US. And in Europe, there is an intimidation that you have to be stupid to think there's an argument. I don't know. I mean, you know better than I why people are afraid to be called names, which is really the tool.
You have worked all your life in the atmosphere, physics, and you know everything about that. I'm sure there will be colleagues. Yes, you know a lot. Yeah. Can you make a summary of the situation? Do we have a climate change, and is man-made mainly?
The answer to the first is yes, and the answer to the second is no. No, you know, one of the things, I think we've discussed this before, the whole notion of this argument has so many things wrong with it at every stage that you start criticizing one and you forget to criticize the other, and it begins to sound strange that everything is wrong. But let me give you an example. What you call climate is wrong. I mean, you're given a graph, you're shown, you know, for 150 years it's gone up by 1 degree or so, and you've said, be afraid. And here there is the phenomenon I occasionally mention. You say that to a normal person, he's not at the university, he's a working person. He says, what are you talking about? You know, I should be afraid of a temperature change that I deal with every day between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. what's this about? And I think in America, at least, a majority of what I'd call ordinary people don't take this issue seriously. On the other hand, there is the phenomenon of the so-called educated elite, who are far more supportive of this issue and seem to ignore the fact that 1 degree is small, and they're willing to believe that it's the end of the world. And I occasionally wonder, I mean, as a teacher, why is that? I mean, what have we done wrong to produce this? And I think there's a reason, and I refer to that as the good student problem. If you look at mathematics or physics, let's consider the scientists in the 19th century, and you try to think of those who made an impact on the 20th century, and you will probably have trouble coming up with more than 15 names. In math, maybe 6. And so you have real important breakthroughs are rare. On the other hand, education, even in the 19th century, was a large operation. And yet there's a tendency to combine the two, that teachers are researchers and so on. To some extent that's true, but in the filtering of the process, it's clearly there's something wrong with that notion. But having said that, what then makes a good student? And clearly for most students, it isn't so much that they're going to discover something or create something. That's rare. It's they're going to please their professor. And so what is the skill that they learn? The skill they learn is to rationalize anything, no matter how stupid it is. And so in a way, they're more vulnerable to insane claims. Now, with climate change, I've thought about it. I mean, you know, when it first started, let's say in the 90s, the people promoting climate change actually tried to explain why the small values were important. And I like to explain it, but I find any time you involve anything with math, you lose people. Let me try and explain what the reason is. In past climates, we've had some dramatic differences in climate in the Earth. The glaciations, I mean, Chicago under 2 kilometers of ice, are notable differences. And then you had 50 million years ago with the dinosaurs and alligator-like creatures in Svalbard and so on. You had a warm period, the Eocene period. Now, each of these was characterized by a different temperature between the tropics and the pole. So, for instance, today it's about 40 degrees. During the glaciation, it was about 60. During the Eocene, it was about 20 degrees centigrade. Now, this temperature difference tends to occur between roughly 30 degrees latitude and the pole. And between 30 plus and minus, the tropics, temperature is fairly flat. It does not change a lot with latitude, tapers off. Okay, so what happened is between each of these and the present, there was a change over half the globe of 20 degrees. But, you know, so it's not 20 degrees every place, it's between the pole and so on. So it's half the region and half the Earth. So the change in the mean temperature is 20 divided by 4. So it's 5 degrees. So these major climate changes were associated with a change in the mean of 5 degrees. So they're saying, well, if we take CO2, that might give you a degree, and then we put in positive feedbacks. We say relative humidity is fixed and uniform, go through them, and at least in a model, you can make it get 3 degrees, although it begins to look strange. And so you say, well, 5 degrees was a major climate change. This is going to be pretty big. You can actually test for that. You can look at the temperature change over the last 150 years and see if there was any change in the temperature difference between the tropics and the pole. And there wasn't. There was no polar amplification. So when today they tell you the model is going to give you 3 degrees warming, it's 3 degrees, period. No big change at the pole. And even 3 degrees is pretty small. And yet you can have someone like the Secretary General of the UN without looking, Guterres, yeah, without looking at, all embarrassed, says another half degree and we're boiling. And the only thing you could answer is, can you take out a patent on this? You could make a lot of money if you could do that.
Since people realize that we are in a world full of natural gas and that LNG is changing the geopolitics of the world, suddenly everybody is becoming afraid of the methane emissions and methane escaping from the methane carrier and so on. What is your view on that?
Once you start the CO2 discussion, you sort of have convinced part of the public that the greenhouse effect is evil, and any molecule that is absorbing in the infrared is dangerous. And so they'll come up with an argument that methane, each molecule of methane is, I think, something like 30 times more effective than a molecule of CO2. The reason for that is pretty simple. If you only had a little bit of CO2, it would be just as powerful as methane. It's just you have so much of it compared to methane that you have done what is called saturate the spectrum. All that means is, view the absorption like black paint. So if you have a transparent piece of glass and you put on a light coat of black, it'll have a big attenuation of light. By the time you have a black paint covering that glass, adding more black paint doesn't do anything. It's already opaque. That's what's happened with CO2. Okay, so you now have something that's 30 times more effective. The problem is it's hundreds of times lower in the amount being emitted. And so by the time you factor in the arithmetic of how much is being emitted of CO2, how much is being emitted by all sources of methane, you end up that methane will only give you, from that, 10% of what CO2 does. And even if you had 3 degrees, 0.3 is negligible. So you can't do anything, even if you believed the global warming stuff. Same thing with nitrous oxide. The molecules are even more effective, but the emissions are even less. You're hundreds of times down, and it's 1/13 as effective as the CO2. Now, if you want to get into the details, the situation is even more compelling to ignore methane and nitrous oxide. 2 reasons. One, the obvious one. As you emit more, they begin to saturate. CO2 saturated at 50 parts per million. We're now at 400 something. The other part is, one reason CO2 is even that effective is the main greenhouse gas, which is water vapor, has a window, an opening, where the absorption by methane is strong, not where CO2 is strong. It doesn't have an opening where methane is strong. So methane really is adding simply to the water vapor. And the water vapor also is fairly saturated. And yet, as you know, methane is the excuse for asking the Dutch and the Irish and the French to get rid of half their cows. I mean, this is insane.
Is it true that by drilling in the ice cap in the North Pole or South Pole, that you can measure the CO2 emission for the last million years?
Can't measure emissions per se, but you have bubbles. It's Greenland is not as good. The South Pole is very nice this way because it's too cold to have much snow. So when you have a deep layer of ice, it's hundreds of thousands of years. Okay, so what they do is drill a core and look at the bubbles that are embedded. And they measure the CO2. And of course, it won't be exactly the CO2 that existed at that level. There's diffusion and stress. But they correct for it in a way that I think is more or less reasonable. And so, for instance, what they find is, and it's an important thing that they find, during the glacial maximum, when you had the most ice, CO2 was down to about 180 parts per million. Today it's 400 something. During the pre-industrial period, it looked like it's more or less 280. Okay, 180 is interesting.
Yeah.
What happens if you go down to 160? Does anyone know?
No more photosynthesis.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Photosynthesis basically collapses. All advanced vegetation dies, and so all animal life dies. This is a remarkable pollutant. You cut a little bit more than half off, and you die. I mean, but as to the measurements in ice cores, I think they're reasonably good. They also show the obvious thing, by the way, that the temperature occurs before the CO2 changes, not after.